Hello, this is Little Green Ghouls, and welcome back to Goosebumps Revisited, a series where I break down a classic Goosebumps book and the episode that goes along with it. I will also be told notes for Goosebumps cliches and classic moments. This week, I'm excited to visit Say Cheese and Die again. I had been warned about this book before going in, and for a good reason. This book sucks. It's essentially a very of its time, mean-spirited story about a kid growing to be 600 pounds. I think Stein first had the idea for making a kid grow horribly fat, and Say Cheese and Die was the easiest way to make it happen, because it ignores a lot from the previous book. You should check this one out if you want to see Stein at one of his worst. As with the previous cover, this 1996 one has nothing to do with the actual story, but I still like it. I think these skeleton family scenes are a nice mix of creepy and funny. I noticed the skeletons have eyes this time, unlike in the previous cover, and I think that makes them even more unsettling. The 2004 slime border sticks close to the original, but switches the background and title colors around. As a result, this one actually doesn't look too bad. The tagline is also changed to "Smile for the Camera" on this updated cover. There was again no later 2000s cover, and not much merchandise for this week. We have what is becoming a regular thing, another one of these trading card book tearouts. We also have this 100-piece puzzle of the cover art. Since there wasn't much merchandise, I thought it'd be fun to include a few of these early concept sketches from possible covers. I personally really like this one where the turkey has the carving knife and is going after the family, but it's always interesting to see how these covers come to be. Our front take says, "Think negative, real negative," which is playing off the concept of photo negatives, and I can see why they switched this one out for the younger generations at this point. Our back take says, "Picture perfect nightmare," and I think it's interesting that neither of these tags mention weight at all, because this book is really all about being fat and skinny. But let's read the blurb on the back. Sourball. That's what Greg calls his English teacher, Mr. Sour. He's a real grouch, and now he just gave Greg a big fat F on his oral report. He didn't believe Greg's story, about the camera Greg found last summer, about the pictures it took, about the evil things that happened. Poor Greg, he just wanted to prove old Sourball wrong. But now that he's dug up the camera, bad things are happening. Really bad things. Just like the first time. Okay, let's start this summary. The book opens with our reintroduction to Greg Banks, who is currently shaking with fear in his English class because it's his turn to present his report. This is probably the most relatable Greg has been to me because I also hated doing presentations in front of the class. This presentation has a purpose though, and that's to refresh the reader on the events of the previous book, which I'm kind of thankful for because I'm not gonna lie, after reading one of these books every week for the last 44 weeks, they kind of start to blur together. Greg has to share a true story from his life, so obviously he's chosen to discuss the evil bad luck camera of doom he found last summer with his friends Bird, Michael, and Sherry. His English teacher, Mr. Sour, is unimpressed with this decision and reminds Greg that this was supposed to be a true story. Mr. Sour actually cut Greg off at the best part of his story, because if you recall, the last book had an actual death in it. Spidey, the villainous owner of the evil camera, dies of heart failure after the camera takes his picture. This interaction concludes with Greg getting an F and failing the class, unless he brings the camera to Mr. Sour to prove that it's true. The last book ended with the two bullies, Joey and Mickey, finding the camera in the Kaufman house, so I'm curious to see if Stein will just ignore this, since he has a record of just ignoring previous books when it gets inconvenient. Greg heads to lunch, debating on whether passing English is worth revisiting the camera or not, and just think, if Greg had thought, "Nah, I'm good," this sequel never would have existed. At lunch, we're reintroduced to Greg's awful friends, as Stein takes the time to remind us why Greg's friend Bird is called Bird. He has small, bird-like brown eyes, close together with a long, beak-shaped nose, and he's a soft tuft of feathery brown hair on the top of his head. He's tall and thin, and sort of bobs up and down like a flamingo when he walks. This poor ugly child. He explains the situation with Mr. Sour, and the kids all agree that bringing the camera back is a terrible idea, and while this is happening, Donnie and Brian, who appear to be our new bullies for this story, are eavesdropping on the conversation. We then spend like 7 pages with these kids just saying, "No, don't do it," and Greg deciding he's gonna go do it anyways. How could this possibly fill 7 pages? Well, we have the return of the Stein friend group, so we have to wade through endless cheesy banter. We then spend an entire chapter with Greg thinking about how he's gonna go get the camera, like a detailed step-by-step plan for how he's basically just gonna go to the Kaufman house and pick up the damn camera. This is one of my biggest complaints from the first book, very little plot and a whole lot of padding. The chapter ends with Donnie and Brian appearing from behind as Greg is walking home, and they're like, "Surprise! We stopped by the Kaufman house and found this evil camera," and then proceed to take Greg's picture. This momentarily scares Greg before he realizes it's just a cheap disposable camera. I was kind of hoping they actually had the camera to spice the story up a bit, but no. I get the feeling Greg is gonna go get the camera in the exact way he spent an entire chapter outlining. We get to dinner, and Greg is still thinking about how terrible it's gonna be to go to the Kaufman house and get the camera. We also learn his older brother Terry now works for a photo shop, because we used to actually have to visit these places to get our pictures developed. So I'm assuming this will play a part in the plot later on. The parents leave to visit a sick aunt after dinner, so Greg is finally able to pedal his ass over to the Kaufman house, because we're at 26 pages here of nothing happening so far. He reaches the house and gasps in shock, because, surprise, the house has been torn down. Well, let's just end the book here. Greg, you're failing English. Too bad. He decides to see if the basement is still intact because this house is still kind of in the process of being torn down, it seems, because there's piles of shit everywhere, but he's disappointed to find that the basement is just a dirt hole in the ground now. He leaves defeated, but just before he can get back on his bike, a voice shouts, "Caught you, you're not going anywhere." This ends up being some boy named John, whose family bought the property and tore down the house. John has taken it upon himself to guard the house because some neighborhood kid has been stealing lumber from the property, and John has had enough. Greg makes small talk for a few pages before it's learned that the camera may be in a nearby dumpster, so Greg is off to engage in one of Stein's favorite activities, dumpster diving. Greg is going to need a tetanus shot though, because this is an industrial-sized dumpster full of smashed up house, including all the things from the basement, so he thinks he's on the right track at least. At one point, he sees a pair of eyes staring at him from the trash and starts screaming, only to realize it's just a dead raccoon. But Greg is fucking gross and moves it with his bare hands for some reason. Well, I guess it was for good reason, because the camera's right under the dead raccoon. Greg crawls out of the dumpster with his dirty-ass camera strapped around his neck, and then John starts being a greedy dick. John thinks maybe he wants the camera after all, because it could be an antique, but when he goes to snatch the camera, Greg accidentally takes John's photo, R.I.P. John. Greg panics and prays the camera doesn't maim John, but it's too late and the photo develops and shows John with a giant rusty nail sticking out of the top of his foot, which makes sense considering they're on a demo site. Greg tries to warn John to be careful, but within a page, John has a nail in his foot and is screaming bloody murder. John's dad appears on the scene, and they try to decide whether or not to pull the nail out, and settle on taking John to the hospital. With John out of the way, Greg is like, well, I guess the camera's mine after all, and heads on home, but stops to pick up the picture of John with the nail in his foot as proof for Mr. Sauer. We then jump to the next morning, with Greg racing to school to show Mr. Sauer the camera, except he's intercepted by Sherry, who wants to know why the hell he went and got that camera after they all voted against it. They then proceed to scuffle over the camera, and Sherry gets her picture taken on accident. Greg needs to learn to keep his finger off the trigger. The two kids anxiously wait as the photo develops, and then they're confused when Sherry's picture comes out as a negative. They conclude maybe the camera's broken and nothing bad will happen this time. Sherry then pulls a real dick move and takes Greg's picture out of revenge. She thinks it will make him think twice before bringing the camera to school. This book then makes a bizarre turn as we see what Greg's photo is. "This is horrible," I shrieked. I recognized my face, but I didn't recognize my body. At first, I thought my head was resting on top of a giant balloon. Then I realized that giant balloon was me. In the photo, I weighed about 400 pounds. No joke, 400 pounds. I gaped at the photo, studying my round face and even rounder body. I had about 8 chins. My cheeks were puffed all the way out. The collar of my t-shirt was hidden under one of my flabby chins. The shirt was stretched tight over my chest and only came down to my belly, which bulged nearly to the ground. I looked like a really gross mountain of pudding. "Stop laughing," I snapped at Sherry. "It isn't funny." I grabbed the photo back. I stared at the folds of flab hanging down from my cheeks. My face was so huge and puffy, my eyes looked like little tiny pig eyes. And my stomach hung down over my fat knees. We've established that Stein thinks fat people are just hilarious, so this book is probably not going to go good places. Greg stuffs the picture in his pocket and hurries on to school, all while deluding himself into thinking the camera's broken now and that he won't be on my 600-pound life. We spend a chapter with Greg suffering through other classes before we can reach English. At one point, we learn about bauxite, which is this, in case you were curious like me. We finally reach English class, but surprise, Mr. Sauer's out sick, so Greg is forced to spend another day with his camera, and given his track record on picture taking, everyone is in danger. Greg settles into class to learn about subjunctive tenses, and we get to use Stein's favorite phrase, thrills and chills, and I think this is probably the easiest way to tell which books are his and which ones are heavily ghostwritten. Greg decides to put his camera in his locker when he runs square into Donnie and Brian. I think it's funny we switched out the bullies from the last book. I guess we can just assume that the camera killed them after they found it in the shocker ending. Donnie and Brian of course get the camera and begin to taunt Greg about taking his picture, but before this can happen, the principal appears and Greg is able to escape unscathed. We then hop to after school with Greg walking home with Sherry, and Greg comments that his backpack is feeling a little tight, so I'm thinking the weight gain has begun. They then run into Bert and Michael, who suggest going for a group bike ride. Greg heads home to change into some gym shorts because his jeans are feeling tight, and then when he goes to hop on his bike, both tires pop. You know how fat people can't ride bikes, right? He ends up borrowing his brother's bike for the ride, and then nothing else happens. We jump to the next morning, where Greg proceeds to explode out of his pajamas. As he's bending over to pick up a pillow, all the buttons on his shirt fly off and his pants rip. I think Stein just wanted a story about a kid who gets fat, and Greg was the easiest way to make it happen. It's like the reverse of Stephen King's Thinner. His mom appears to tell him to hurry up for school, and he wants to know if he looks fatter, because when he looks in the mirror he thinks he just looks a little bit puffier. She responds that she's going to put skim milk in his cereal this morning, which is not reassuring to Greg. At school, Greg races to show Mr. Sauer the camera, and his response is, "Hi Greg, putting on a little weight?" Greg ignores this and tries to show off the camera, only to be dismissed again as Mr. Sauer walks over to chat with the principal. Class starts, and we're back to student presentations where we learn Mr. Sauer has 6 cats. Greg interrupts one of the girls' report to ask if he can show off his evil camera to prove his story is true, which Mr. Sauer reluctantly agrees to. Greg goes to present, but I was stuck in the chair, too fat to get out. Greg then wonders to himself what could possibly be causing this, As if he didn't get his picture taken like 24 hours ago. He managed to squeeze out of his desk and then lumbers to the front of the classroom where he starts explaining the camera. At one point he tries to get a picture of John from his pocket, but my fingers were so fat I had trouble poking them into my pocket. My hands felt like squishy balls of dough. They were too blobby to make a fist. This book probably made fat kids feel real great. And we still have quite a bit of book to go at this point, and I don't see the fat hate ending anytime soon. Greg tries to explain the photo, and Mr. Sauer dismisses it as a trick nail and calls the entire thing fake. This enrages Greg, and he flees the classroom in Stein's eloquent writing. I let out a cry of fury and went running for the door. At least, I tried to run, but I was too heavy to move fast. I could only waddle. "Greg, where are you going?" I heard Mr. Sauer call. I pretended I didn't hear him and lumbered to the door. I had the camera tucked under one flabby arm. I pulled the door open with the other, and I bounced into the silent, empty hallway. In the hallway, Greg runs into Sherry, whose skirt proceeds to immediately fall down because, surprise, she's getting thinner as Greg gets fatter. In fact, she's lost 8 pounds already. Sherry's been so preoccupied with her own weight loss that she didn't even notice that Greg's weight gained, but when she does, she says, "Oh, gross, you look really weird," then wonders out loud, why is this happening to us? Really, Sherry? You too? You can't think of anything that could be causing this? Before ending the scene, Greg manages to rip his pants from bending over to pick up some books. We then move to later in the day, where Greg thinks that playing baseball will be a good idea. There we are treated to some even more fat jokes about Greg supersizing every meal, commentary on how tight his clothes fit him now, and how disgusting he is. We also get a scene when he tries to run to second base, but he can barely get there. When Greg slides to the base, he can't get up because he's too fat, and rolls around like an upside down turtle for a bit. It's like one joke forever now in this book. We get it, Stein, the kid is fat. At dinner, it's revealed Greg has put on 300 pounds over the course of the day, and the parents don't seem to be as worried as they should be. Like, this would warrant a trip to the emergency room, but instead the dad asks if he ate too many candy bars at school that day. It just occurred to me that when Sherry went missing in the first book, Greg tore up the picture and she reappeared. Couldn't he just tear up the fat photo to fix this? Greg's mom thinks maybe he's having an allergic reaction and wants to take him to an allergist. Greg can't handle all of this and waddles into the living room. He then begs his parents not to force him to go to school tomorrow because he thinks he'll be mocked relentlessly, but they're like, "Nope, can't miss school. Just tell the bullies you're sick. They'll understand." So, some A+ parenting going on here. They send him on his way with these words of encouragement: "Don't be embarrassed." And then they leave Greg to fend for himself. At school, Greg describes himself as a pile of jello, a Thanksgiving Day parade float, and worries about falling and squishing kids. In Mr. Sauer's class, we get even more endless fat jokes as Mr. Sauer worries Greg will block out the sun, and says Greg's been eating too much of the 4 food groups and sends him to the nurse. At the nurse's office, we see Sherry, and things aren't looking too good for her either. It took me a few seconds to recognize her. Her jeans and t-shirt appeared to be about 10 sizes too big. Her arms were as thin as toothpicks. Her face was pale and puckered. Her head had shrunk. It looked like a tiny lemon on her frail noodle-like body. "Look at me, I'm shrieking away, I'm so light. It took me hours to walk to school this morning because the wind kept pushing me back." Greg has to lift his stomach up to fit through the doorway, and Sherry finally states the obvious, that this is happening because of the camera. I think no one reading this could possibly think it was anything else, so why would the characters? This book is extra bad. After school, Greg's dad picks him up in a rental van because Greg can't fit into the family car. On the way to the doctor's office, the van supposedly can't even pick up speed due to Greg's weight. At the office, the doctor can't weigh Greg because the scale doesn't go high enough, and at one point, the stethoscope gets stuck in one of the fat folds on Greg's chest. The doctor doesn't know what's wrong with him and sends him back home to wait for the test results to come back. At home, Greg attempts to call Sherry, but his fingers are so big now he keeps dialing extra numbers by accident. Eventually he reaches her and announces he's coming over, with the camera, and she can barely talk because she's lost 5 more pounds. Greg heads over to Sherry's, which is just right next door, but we still manage to squeeze in some more fat jokes about how he's too big to use an umbrella and how he hides the camera in one of his folds. Once out the door, he runs into John, who, for reasons unexplained, knows where Greg lives. John asks where he can find Greg, because at this point Greg is so large that he's unrecognizable, so he's able to trick John into searching a few blocks away. Once at Sherry's house, she's so thin she has to tie her belt in a knot to keep her pants up, and when Greg goes to sit on her bed, he smashes it to the ground under his weight. We finally get to hear Greg's new plan, and it's to take new pictures of themselves to see if the camera can reverse what it's done, and since Sherry can't think of any other option, she agrees to this. She takes Greg's picture and sits by him as it develops, but he has her move away in case he tips over and crushes her. Once the picture is finished, they see that this plan has failed because this picture shows Greg is still huge, but now covered in scales. And suddenly I could see myself. My huge blobby face, my round balloon body, still enormous, still enormously fat. Sherry was shaking her tiny head sadly, staring at the darkening photo. "What's that on your face?" she cried. "Yuck." I grabbed the snapshot for her and held it close. "Oh no," I groaned. "My skin, it's all scaly. I look like an alligator or something." "The scaly stuff is on your arms too," she said. "It looks like reptile skin or something." And as she said that, I started to itch. I glanced down and saw red scales covering my arms. Itchy red patches. I started to scratch. But the scratching made the scales itch even worse. My skin flaked off under my fingernails. "Oh yuck," I moaned. "It itches so bad." I scratched my arms, then I scratched my face. More dry skin peeled off as I scratched. Chunks of skin. I pulled a chunk of red scaly skin off the back of my hand. I'm sorry, Greg, she choked out, but you look so gross, I think I'm gonna be sick. I have to say, the skin stuff is pretty nasty, and Sherry finds herself so grossed out that she nearly joins the vomit count, but alas, she's able to hold it in. Sherry then has an aha moment and suggests ripping up the pictures to see if they revert back to normal, but Greg worries they'll disappear completely. Greg, were you not in the first book? This is how you brought Sherry back. I hate when Stein puts zero effort into his storytelling. I mean, generally he's fine, but good god, when he's bad, he's really bad. Sherry's about to rip up the pictures, but she chickens out because she thinks she'll be torn up too in real life. Greg then leaves us with an I have an idea moment, and then we jump to a new scene without explaining what this idea was. We're now at the photo shop where Greg's brother Terry works, and I should have known we'd arrive here, but I forgot Terry existed, honestly. At the shop, Terry's briefly disgusted at his brother's new scales, and then Greg jumps right into his new big plan. He wants Terry to reverse the photos, so he wants to make Sherry's negative photo positive, and Greg's photo negative with the hopes of reversing them in real life. Why the hell not at this point? It's not like any of this makes sense anyways. At first, Terry's like, well, I'm a little busy at the moment, so Greg has to offer up his next 2 months worth of allowance. Terry does the reversing, and then the kids just wait for the magic to happen. While waiting, a chunk of skin falls off of Greg's forehead and lands on the sidewalk. We cut to the next morning, and Greg bounces out of bed because he's no longer 400 pounds. He greets his parents, who are ecstatic and conclude they knew it just had to be some sort of allergic reaction. He races next door and finds that Sherry's also back to normal. The two kids head to school, but Greg races back inside to get his camera first because he has plans for revenge. He's gonna take Mr. Sauer's picture for not believing him earlier, and for being such a jerk to him when he was fat. This backfires quickly though, because in a final page twist, Mr. Sauer grabs the camera and takes a photo of the entire class, including Greg. And then this book is finally fucking over. Say Cheese and Die Again got a direct episode pairing, so we're back to the original Goosebumps series this week, although checking out the Haunting Hour has been pretty fun. Our notable actor this week is Patrick Thomas, just for the sake of replacing Ryan Gosling, because this kid didn't go on to do much else acting-wise, so let's just get to the episode. This nightmare intro is kind of out of left field, but look what they had to work with plot-wise.
Want to play with the camera? Here. Say cheese!
No, don't take my picture!
I remember writing reports that required special little folders like this. Is that still a thing?
The curse of the evil camera.
They do a nice job establishing Mr. Sauer as unlikable right from the get-go.
Right?
One moment, please. I'm not done yet.
I forgot they switched out the coffin house for this weird industrial building.
Say cheese, say cheese.
I do appreciate that they took out the building in this version too.
Oh man, the building's gone. They blew it up. Now I'm gonna fail.
So he's just gonna fall in a hole and find it, I guess. I've noticed the TV show loves to insert bats. More bats in case you didn't get enough the first time. This child did not learn his lesson.
I feel an A coming.
This camera just looks kind of silly to me now.
What are you doing?
This Greg shows no mercy. He will kill for an A in English.
To me now.
Why would he even be considering taking his own photo after the first book? Uh-oh, we got some lurking in the shadow shots.
Say cheese, say cheese.
Sherry, you're gonna die.
No! Give it to me!
I thought this was a dick move on her part.
Are you nuts?
Well, if it's broken, you wouldn't mind me taking your picture.
Well, they certainly dialed back the weight gaining.
No! I'm fat! It's
Oh lord, here we go.
What's happening?
What in earth is going on with his cheeks?
No! No! No!
Not the fisheye lens.
It's Sherry.
Sherry, I woke up and I was huge. I'm like a blimp.
This is just kind of messed up. Like, they didn't even make him that big, which is almost worse.
Oh, forget it.
This episode probably gave some bigger kids a complex.
Excuse me.
It takes a lot of concentration to do well on the battlefield.
What are you doing in this grotesque costume? Get rid of this padding.
It's not a cop.
Sherry gets death bells.
Sherry, you look so skinny. What happened to you?
I eat and eat, but nothing seems to work. I weigh 10 less pounds than I did a few hours ago.
This episode is just awkward to watch.
Uh-oh, I'm getting that feeling. Oh.
I think you just lost another pound.
I would have liked to see the episode give him scales, but we're just getting more fat.
Here goes. This wasn't a good idea. So panic.
At least they made a better attempt at the makeup for the second half.
Hey, Sherry.
It's not a joke. You have to help us.
Remember that?
I like that the stakes are him literally exploding and the Sherry turned into bones.
Terry!
Sherry!
Well, that worked fast.
Greg!
It worked. It worked.
Alright, time for a plot twist.
You haven't proven anything.
But I was a blimp.
Look at this. That's quite amusing. Your body.
Look, he's losing his hair.
Say cheese.
Overall, I thought Say Cheese and Die Again was just as bad as everybody said it was. I thought it was oddly mean-spirited for a Goosebumps book, and Stein really goes hard on the fat equals funny that a lot of older children's media has. It's definitely a product of its time, but aside from the fat stuff, this book was also just boring and lazy. I really didn't enjoy how he just ignored what happened in the previous book, especially when it came to tearing up the photos and the disappearance of the two bullies. It just feels low effort to make a sequel and ignore everything that was previously established. I also didn't like, despite that it was one of the shorter books, it went hard on the padding, like we were nearly 40 pages in before anything interesting even happened. I'm gonna give this one 1 out of 5 rusty nails. This one sucked in a way that was just beyond being boring for a change. Okay, on to our totals. Say Cheese and Die Again didn't have any vomit, shoulder scares, asshole victims, it was only dreams or pranks, but it did have a 90s moment. In Getting Jiggy with the 90s, we had one 90s moment. This was when Greg's brother is working in a photo shop, because you just don't see these places like you used to. This raises our total to 142 jiggy 90s moments. Say Cheese and Die Again had fewer than the typical amount of chapter cliffhangers with 9, probably because just not a whole lot happens in this story. This raises our Goosebumps total to 535. Our clunky cliffhanger award this week has to be chapters 17 to 18, where our intended cliffhanger is Greg getting stuck in his desk due to his sudden weight gain. Shocker ending. Our big twist for this book was honestly pretty expected when Mr. Sauer takes the entire class's photo, including Greg's, and we wait to see what the photo shows. Kinda like the ending in the original. This brings our Goosebumps series total to 37. Well, that's it for Say Cheese and Die Again. I really didn't like this one. I thought it was way too apparent that Stein had one idea and ham-fisted it into a sequel and padded it from there. Next week we have Ghost Camp, and I'm looking forward to this one, because the previous two camp books that I hadn't read ended up being among my favorites, so I hope this one can keep up the trend. Let me know in the comments what you thought of Say Cheese and Die Again. What's scarier, getting fat or getting thin? Why was Mr. Sauer such an asshole? Should this have been a trilogy where they finally destroyed the camera? Also, what did you think of my foodish horror clips this week? I don't know, I struggled with the theme for this one and went for vaguely food-related horror. Anyways, as always, thanks again for watching, and make sure you subscribe for
The pride. The love.